Hello, and welcome to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, with me, Mark Vernon, and
Rowland Smith. Hello, Mark. Nice to talk to you.
Hi there, Robert. Look, this is a new venture for us, and I thought we should just say for a moment or two, what is the Philosophy Slam? What does it mean to you? We've done a lot of these things. How does it enthuse you dealing with ideas and thoughts and the juxtapositions of clashing problems in this way?
Yeah, well, we've done Philosophy Slam for a long time, as you say, originally back in the School of Life about 15 years ago or more. And I think the idea has always been to combine these two things, philosophy and slam. Philosophy for us, though, we're philosophers, but we're also interested in psychology, in art, in politics and science. So philosophy is a bit of a loose catch-all term for us, although we've both written books about philosophy. So that's the philosophy bit. And then the slam bit is the jam. The slam is the jam, it's the improv, it's taking ideas and seeing where we go with them, really.
And you, Robert, have written on a wide range of these sort of different subjects. So there is philosophy, clearly, maybe more modern philosophy. I have a rooted academic interest in ancient philosophy. Yours is in modern philosophy, but also the psychology side, both in terms of engaging with psychological ideas, but also in the practice, systemic constellations, and thinking about how psychology works, inner dynamics work across groups and even across generations. But then also the literature is really important to you, bringing that in. We often have a bit of etymology that is incredibly revealing. Philology, is part of our love as well. So that's all to say, this just to give some indication of the way that we can range in the Philosophy Slam and what might appear spontaneously.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said, Mark, because you've got to practice as a psychotherapist. I've got to practice doing systemic constellations. We've both written books between us. And so, yeah, I think this is an interdisciplinary time together, isn't it? Where we riff on ideas. And we should say when we do this live in person, because this is a podcast that is a spin-off from our huge sellout Wembley Arena filling gigs. We have audience members who just throw out a single word at us. It could be completely random. And the idea is then we just riff on them, basically, and develop ideas just for a few minutes, each of us, and see where we get to. And often you and I are surprised where we end up in the conversation, actually. It's not like we've arrived with a script. And how could we? Because we don't know what people are going to say to us.
No, very much. And that is part of the thrill. So look, Philosophy Slam, the podcast, welcome. Let's now get underway, Robert.
Let's go.
Welcome to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, where the serious meets the serendipitous. I'm Mark Vernon, and I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert.
Hello, Mark. So the idea of the Philosophy Slam is that we respond to serendipitous or random words that are thrown out to us. And when we perform live, we get all sorts of bizarre concepts and phrases that are put forward to us. And so we thought we'd pick up on a couple that we've heard recently, particularly juicy ones we heard recently. We'll take these two words and see where we can go with them. Error and quality.
Very good. Okay, do you want to pick it up? Error and quality, where did your mind go?
Well, I thought about exams was my first thought, because this is a space in which errors and quality are both in the forefront. Because if you make errors, you get bad marks, and quality is the thing that you're being assessed on. So error and quality come together in exams. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But because as we both are, I'm very interested in etymology. I was thinking about the word error as related to the word and errant. And it comes from the Latin word to do with wandering, or wandering away from the right path or the true path. And presumably quality is about remaining on the right path. So quality could be seen as non-deviation from the right path, if you like. Of course, quality also has a completely different set of associations, not just quality as being good value, but quality as the quality of something, quality as opposed to quantity, characteristics of something. So there's all sorts of things going on in that. What were your first reactions when you heard those two words?
I find the word quality very fascinating for the reasons you were just moving towards there, actually, the kind of whatness. sense of quality. And I guess that's where the etymology of that word lies. And it always fascinated me that Plato, for example, will talk about quality, but he won't talk about quantity. Quantity is actually a word that was coined by Aristotle a few decades later. And so I'm very fascinated by the distinction between quality and quantity. And to bring back in error, the idea that now the quantitative sense of something, if you can put a number on it, if you like, that's going to reveal something true. Whereas quality, well, that's more personal. That's more a subjective kind of assessment and might well be erroneous, or at least maybe true for me, but not true for you. And so it fascinates me that quantity is actually the newer word. And presumably for great stretches of time, our ancestors felt no, quality is what's really going to tell you the truth about something. And certainly for Plato, the reason why the whatness matters is because it takes you into the nature of that which you're discussing. It reveals, if you like, its inner life. The felt quality tells you something about its soul even. And if you can get in touch with that, then you can get more in touch with reality itself, even in Plato. It's the sort of the pathway to a fuller sense of things. And so notions like quantity, I do think that the word didn't exist because there wasn't really a need for it. The idea that somehow the number of things might tell you something of any significance really didn't occur to people until you get the more empirical method of Aristotle coming along. And his modus operandi, Aristotle, is always to kind of gather loads of examples of whatever he's studying and then try and infer commonalities, if you like, characteristics and features. It might be political systems. It might be plants and animals. He uses this method quite generally. But you can see how quantity, therefore, really starts to matter. And of course, it matters very much now as well in a scientific age.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, quantity seems to be absolutely dominant these days because we measure everything. There are algorithms for this and that. I'm a big football fan and everything's very statistics related now. You can't watch a game without having endless statistics flash up on the screen where goals are measured and errors are measured and fouls in that sense, to bring it back to error again. So errors and deviation are measured endlessly in sports and in all sorts of performance related arenas. When you were speaking there about quality, it made me think there is I think probably an even later Latin word which I think retrospectively taken into philosophy, which is quiddity. So quiddity is the thatness of an entity. The quid means that really in Latin. And quiddity seems one of those terms in philosophy that's designed to intimidate students, really, because it's Latinate. I don't think the Romans ever really used a word that was the equivalent to quiddity, but it seems to capture the spirit of a lot of analytic philosophy, which is trying to get at the very essence of things. If only we could reduce the essence of Mark or Robert, to one thing and boil it down, which is irreducible any further, then we'd know everything. There would be a quiddity, a thatness, a what-isness about Mark and Robert. Whereas actually quality is a bit more of a generous word, isn't it, when we talk about the quality of their interaction or the quality of the experience? Because although there is a number that might be associated with that, we're talking about words as well as numbers, actually, when we talk about quality, aren't we? And we're allowing for a width or a breadth or a depth of experience, I suppose, that quantity doesn't always allow. And I suppose when we do live in a world of numbers so much, we'd like to get back a bit more, I think, probably to quality and probably further away from quiddity. Although quiddity these days, I suppose, it would be translated as identity. What is that? What is that thing? Well, it's whatever they identify as,
I like what you say about quiddity, and I like the awkwardness of it, because I think that often words, if they feel a bit awkward, they're telling you something about, they're slightly constructed, they're slightly artificial. Exactly. And I'm sure you're right about quiddity. I don't know off the top of my head, but I bet it's a medieval Latinate phrase. Yeah. Because what it will be connected to, I imagine, is the separation of what you were talking about there, the essence of something from its existence.
Yeah, exactly.
And in Plato's time, essence and existence were felt to be part and parcel of the same thing, the same kind of participation. But what happens, I think, particularly around the 12th and 13th century, you get figures like William of Ockham and Duns Scotus. These, interestingly, followers of St. Francis, actually. They were Franciscan thinkers. But it causes this huge shift that now was sometimes called nominalism. That's, history of ideas, people will tell you, is absolutely fundamental to the modern sense of things. But precisely the idea that you can separate something's, thatness, its quiddity from its essence, the essence from the existence. And this becomes really important when it comes to thinking about God, because what it prepares the ground for is the idea that there could be a notion of, say, a perfect being, but that perfection wouldn't need to include that it actually existed. Whereas before, when the two notions were interwoven, perfection and existence would be seen as part and parcel of the same thing.
Yeah.
So this very kind of abstract, esoteric sort of thoughts, and then this awkward word quiddity actually has huge ramifications in terms of the way that we experience life. Because what it does lead to eventually is the sense that what's going on inside our heads needn't be connected to what's going on around the world at all. It might be purely fabricated by our brains, as neuroscience would tell us now.
Yeah.
So you get this great uncoupling from the world around us that it's captured even in that little word, that strange, awkward word quiddity.
Well, the first person who came to mind, actually, when these two words flashed up, error and quality, was John Milton, because I'm certain, though I can't quote it, that in Paradise Lost Book 9, he does pun on the word error and erring and so on, because, of course, Adam and Eve err from the true path insofar as they disobey God and eat from the fruit of the tree. So error is essential there. But what's interesting about error in Milton is that error is developmental in a way. Error is what allows for free choice. Disobedience produces responsibility. So when you err from the one true path, you're also embracing your own existence, in fact, rather than essence. I mean, one of the key things I think that Milton's trying to get at in setting his story in the Garden of Eden is that there is this transition when humanity arises from essence, the permanent, eternal nature of God, to existence, which is the temporal, mortal nature of human beings. And mortal human beings then are subject to error because they now have free will in this world of existence rather than essence. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It actually brings them a quality to their life, richness, variation, which isn't totally predetermined, isn't perfect, can be subject to all sorts of narrative and so on. And in a way, in the Garden of Eden is the beginning of human narrative, according to that myth, where suddenly all sorts of contingencies can arise. And the way of error is also the way of developing character, developing quality, developing history, which can only happen once time is sort of broken into this spatial distribution, rather than contained in the one, the God, the unchanging and the permanent. So I think Milton is an interesting example there. And of course he would have been very familiar with Duns Scotus and Aristotle and all of that.
I even wonder whether Milton might have known of a detail from Dante. So Dante's Divine Comedy plays with the notion of error and erring and heresy, actually, as well. And what happens, particularly in one moment of the Divine Comedy in the Inferno, so the first great canticle where they're descending through the famous circles of hell, is that nearly always when you descend through hell, Dante says, you turn to the left, you keep going to the left, the kind of sinister direction. But on two occasions, they decide they're going to turn to the right. They kind of err from the path that even in the darkness should be set before them. And the first time they do this is in the circle of the heretics. They've come through the great walls of Dis. They've been terrified by demons, but they've sort of survived that threshold. And they come into this sort of field where there's lots of coffins, the lids are half off, there's flames sort of poking up through the lids. It's a bit, Hollywood kind of image of hell at this point. And it's where there are lots of heretics. And there they turn to the right rather than to the left. And I think what Dante's saying is that this journey is not just a literal journey. It's a kind of psychological journey where you have to participate in the zone that you're actually in. So they have to err in some measure in order to be there. And so they turn to the right and they encounter various figures. They encounter their first pope, their first infernal pope at this moment, interestingly enough. Anastasius II, a very early pope, one of many popes that are found in the Inferno. But what it's also saying, though, is something more subtle, because Dante's always saying something more subtle, and this maybe links back to the thoughts you were alluding to there with the Garden of Eden, is that although at first pass they've done something wrong, they've erred, they've turned to the right rather than to the left, they kind of have to do that as well in order to make the journey their own. So they're not just following robotically the right way. And so I think Dante is saying that our freedom, interestingly, will lead us astray, but somehow that is what also makes us who we are. And that being who we are is actually necessary for discovering the path back to God, strangely. And so you get this sort of subtle thing in Christianity, certainly with the myth of Adam and Eve, where it comes to be talked about, the erring that Adam and Eve made, as the happy fault, because it makes them who they are as people. And so therefore, as people, they're able to know God all the more in the fullness of time, when the path actually does lead them back to the divine. So this strange thing where error is kind of part of us, and not just as a sort of failure.
No, exactly. It's what in transcendental philosophy you'd call a condition of possibility, because the condition of possibility to do good is the same as the condition of possibility to do bad, to err. And of course, to err is to forgive. To err is human. To forgive is divine. Is the other phrase at the back of this, and it is about humanity. We make mistakes when we err. Just picking up on the turning to the left and turning to the right, I mean, use the word sinister. And for those of people who don't know listening to us, the word sinister is obviously associated with the left. Dexter is the right, and sinister is the left. And that's where we get the word dexterity, being right-handed. And of course, there is an association with doing the right thing, although they're completely different etymological roots, of course. But the sinister is what's left-handed. And then presumably somewhere in the world, somebody's written a doctorate on the bias towards or against left-handedness in the history of Western thinking. And presumably there is some corrective somewhere that says left-handedness is actually the right way, the non-errant way. Some people do still associate left-handedness with creativity and being a little bit gifted and special, both in sort of good and bad ways, actually. But yeah, I think you're probably right there. From Dante to Milton, although I don't know if Milton quotes Dante very much. It's very allusive. I don't know if he quotes him very much. But I think the theology is the same in a way. The Garden of Eden, disobedience, the turning away, is what actually allows us to fulfill ourselves and become human, actually, with all our human qualities. That's very interesting.
There's another angle on this which always fascinates me, which is that science rests on quantities, as we were saying. I mean, it rests on a whole lot more besides, but nonetheless, quantity is absolutely of the essence in science, measurement and assessment and gathering and statistics and so on. Whereas quality, at least in principle, you might think the scientists would want to strip out qualities because they have this kind of subjective feel to them. Although I think actually aesthetics, just as an aside, is an absolutely crucial part of science. If something looks beautiful, looks simple, looks elegant, you're much more likely to go for it. I did a physics degree at one point, and people endlessly talked about the beauty of the maths that lies behind physics, and there's something about the maths, the beauty and reality that is all linked up together, a very Platonic notion. But nonetheless, nowadays, if you want the truth, you're much more likely to say, I want the quantitative assessment of it. I want the fact. I want the statistic. But what's so interesting about that is that science doesn't stand still. Science is continually changing. I'm old enough now to have done my physics in an age when, for example, people just assumed that the Big Bang, say, was kind of gospel truth. Of course, there was a Big Bang. Whereas now, 30 or so years later, it's a major enterprise in physics to sort of test and push at the Big Bang. Is that really right? Is there a big crunch? Is there a big bounce? Are there all sorts of other possibilities? So the point is, anyway, that even physics, this supposedly most robust of the sciences, is constantly changing, constantly evolving. And of course, that's what makes science interesting, because you want to know about the latest developments. That's normally wrapped up in a kind of story that this is a steady progress to the final truth. But then, of course, everyone knows that there are quantum leaps in science, and there are paradigm shifts as well. Anyway, but the point is that all this pursuit of knowledge, I don't doubt it's pursuit of knowledge, wrapped up with quantity, strangely shifts and changes really quite regularly. Whereas quality, I think, is much more steady. The sense of what's beautiful, it obviously continually gets challenged, particularly in the modern world, but nonetheless it gets challenged against what you might call accepted sorts of beauty, a shared sort of experience of that which has quality. That's lasted really for quite a long time. And I love Plato, and going back all the way to Plato's time in ancient Athens. If you go into a museum and they have a statue of a beautiful man or a lovely goddess, those will be standards of beauty that still touch us directly now. So strangely, quality, I think, might be a much more reliable guide to life. I say, with my sort of Platonic hat on, than quantity, for all that quantity is obviously hugely useful in making of technology and all that kind of side of our modern lives.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to a 60th birthday dinner last night, and of course, that was all about the number 60. And the speech given by the birthday boy was about reflecting on this number. But of course, my reflection was, you're still the same person. The quality you now project at the age 60 is very much the quality you projected when I first met you, when you were 21, actually, was when we first met. So it's interesting you're talking there about quality abiding, really, as quantities shift and change and accumulate, in this case, through the numbers of age. And I was also, maybe we should finish in a moment, but I was also thinking as you were talking there about science changing over time and the concept of margin for error or margin of error, because that is something in a way where science says, we're not going to get this completely right. Let's build in a margin of error. And particularly in recent political times, it reminds me of all the polls that keep getting things wrong. Despite all the polling in this country or America or other parts of the world that says we're absolutely going to have a government of this stripe or that stripe, actually, when it comes down to it, there are all sorts of qualitative reasons why the quantity doesn't quite capture what's going on underneath. And actually, we end up then reverting to qualitative measures to capture the mood of the nation, for example. And you can't really talk about the mood of the nation in a quantitative fashion. You really have to reach for qualitative descriptors.
I like that thought, sir. Anything that reminds me that I'm human and not machine is helpful to me. Well, look, thanks, Robert. That's where we went with quality and error. You have been listening to Philosophy Slam, the podcast.